Hello everyone, in my previous few videos I've been working on my custom FPV freestyle frame, the Tubular Quad V7. So make sure to check out those videos to understand why in the world I'm using tubes for arms, learn about all the latest design changes for this current version, and to see how this frame is built. In this video, we're going to finish the build by installing all the electronics, and I'll also explain why I'm using the electronics that I'm using. And at the end of the video, we will weigh the completed build to see how light it is. Now, for the first time in tubular quad history, kits are available. So there's two kits. The first is the tubular quad, which has the tubes for arms, which have a variety of performance benefits, but the build is a little bit more in depth. So if you want a simpler build while retaining the lightweight responsive design, there's also the non-tubular quad, which uses flat arms. Both kits have a reconfigurable fuselage to best support both analog and digital users. So make sure to check out those kits. And without further ado, let's finish this build. So the first order of business is disassembling the Tubular Quad version 6, since I'm going to be reusing most of the components for the version 7. Now that all of the components are out of the version 6, it's time to put them in the version 7. I'm going to start by replacing one of the motor wire extensions that got ripped off, and I'll also add some heat shrink to the only areas of the motor wires that are exposed, since those get chewed up over time. So here I realize the motors aren't sitting flat, so I have to undo some work and do some clearancing. I'll talk more about how this happened later in the video. So right when I thought I had the motor wires nicely tucked and soldered, I realized some of the motor wires were damaged, so I'm undoing work to replace those wires. Alright, I actually want to pause the build right here to discuss some of the frustrations I've had up until this point. So, in my experience, no quad build is without its hiccups, but this one has had a lot more hiccups than usual, and I don't just want to edit them out and make the perfect video. I want to be real with you guys, share these experiences, because at the end of the day, I feel like these kinds of frustrations are all part of the hobby. Frustration number one was my fault, and that was wrapping the carbon toe reinforcement around the arm and motor mount too wide so that the motor couldn't sit flat. So I actually do this kind of every time I build the tubular quad by accident. I mark a line where I'm not supposed to wrap past, and then somehow I always manage to wrap past that line, and then I have to go back and trim back to the line after everything has cured. The only difference this time was I had already started putting the motors on and mounting all the arms and routing the wires. So I had to undo work, which is always super frustrating. And to add insult to injury, like one of the bases of the motors was bent, so I had to fix that as well. The next frustration was desoldering the battery leads and capacitor from the Hobbywing ESC. It's super nice that they solder those on if you're gonna use the ESC in exactly the way they think you're going to use it. But in my case, I want to tuck the motor wires forward and aft on the fuselage. I want the battery lead to come out a very specific way on the side. I probably just need a more powerful soldering iron, but there was a mountain of solder holding those on, along with some potting on the capacitor, and it was just super time consuming to get off. I felt like the battery leads were sucking a lot of heat away from the joint I was trying to melt. So I actually cut the battery leads off to prevent that, and I think that was the turning point for me, because after that I was actually able to start to get things desoldered. The next hurdle was I got all the motor wires soldered on, and then I realized one of the sets of motor wires looked kind of frayed and the insulation was coming off, so I had to take off one of the arms, redo the motor wire extensions, put it all back together. So again, undoing work is super frustrating. If I did it all again, I would have just replaced all of those motor wire extensions because these motors are not brand new. So hindsight is 20/20. And while I was doing that, I also noticed that these reliefs for the motor wires at the ends of the arms had a really sharp edge on them from machining. So they were starting to cut into some of the motor wires. So I just went ahead and knocked those down with a hobby knife. So that's something I haven't experienced in the past because I have cut these all from hand historically. I think we're past the hardest part, which is tucking all the motor wires. You certainly don't have to do it, but it looks awesome. So before I get ahead of myself, I want to hook this thing up to Betaflight, spin the motors, make sure everything's working so far, and then hopefully it's smooth sailing from here on. So before I spin the motors, I am going to transfer all of the wires from the dead flight controller to the new flight controller. Wow, those motors sound super smooth and not beat up at all. Up next, I am printing some arm bumpers, an FPV camera mount, and a GoPro mount. The capacitor that came with the ESC is absolutely gargantuan, so I am remote mounting it in the front of the quad instead of having it stick out the side. Just like that, the Tubular Quad version 7 is complete. Luckily, the second half of the build went a lot more smoothly than the first half, so I'm feeling a lot better and I'm excited to finally get this thing in the air after spending all of this time designing and building it. So before that, I want to cover all of the components that I'm using on this frame because this honestly is a pretty oddball freestyle setup, so I want to explain to you guys why I use all of these components because I do have reasons for pretty much everything. So let's start from the outside and work our way in, starting with the arm bumpers. These are just custom 3D printed TPU arm bumpers that I designed. They're super light, just 2 grams for all 4, and they protect the relatively thin carbon at the ends of the arms. And they've worked pretty well for the past few versions, so no complaints there. The props are the Ethix K2 6-inch twin blades. These are my favorite props out of any prop, 5-inch, 6-inch, twin blade, tri-blade. I've yet to find a better prop than the Ethix K2s, but I will be trying some new props in the near future. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those reviews. Spinning those props are the Hyperlite E-Series 2205.5 1922 kV motors. This is definitely an oddball choice. These are very small motors for a 6-inch quad, just 2205.5. Now, I kind of tried these just as an experiment to see if such a small motor could have decent response on a quad like this, and it actually flew fine, so I haven't changed them since. I think part of that is due to the fact that this quad is really light and has a really low moment of inertia, so you don't need a fat, torquey motor to get this thing to do quick maneuvers. Also, bigger motors are not always better. More torque is always better for responsiveness, but to get more torque in the real world, you need a heavier motor, and that adds weight at the ends of your arms. And there actually is a point where making the motor bigger actually decreases the response of the quad because you've added so much weight to the ends of the arms. So for this specific quad, 2205.5 is plenty, and I'd say for any lightweight 6-inch, 2206 is plenty. Also, the kV on these motors is pretty low at 1922 kV. I used to run higher kV, like 2200 kV on 4S, but I found I was never really using the top part of the throttle, and by dropping to a lower kV, you actually get more resolution on your throttle stick and it makes the quad easier to control. So I've stuck with the lower kV on these motors. For cameras, I'm running the GoPro Hero 8. This is getting kind of old at this point, but the newer GoPros are all heavier except for the skeleton one, which I may upgrade to in the future. But for now, because it's pretty light, I'm sticking with the GoPro 8. The FPV camera is the Foxeer Aero Micro Pro. It's just a micro camera and it's light. That's all that matters to me. Behind that, I've remote mounted the capacitor for the stack. Ideally, it would be mounted right on the ESC, but I'm on 4S anyways, probably don't need a capacitor at all. So remote mount up front it is. For the stack, I'm running the Hobbywing 20x20 stack. I've tried a lot of other stacks, and I don't know if I've tried any stack that doesn't have some problem or another. So I'm sticking with the Hobbywing stuff for now. The flight controller has a 2 amp 5-volt BEC, which means I can drive my video transmitter directly on 5 volts. And I haven't actually tried out the Hobbywing ESC yet, so I'll let you guys know if it has any issues. The video transmitter is the TBS Unify Pro 5 volt, not the high voltage. The 5 volt is actually smaller and lighter, which is why I use it. On that video transmitter is the TBS Dum Dum antenna. It's just a U.F.L. antenna that mounts directly to the video transmitter. No heavy SMA connectors to be found. And all of that is mounted on top of the LemonRX Diversity DSMX satellite. Yes, I fly Spektrum. No, Spektrum is not the best protocol, but for my flying, it works just fine. And LemonRX was making Diversity satellites long before Spektrum themselves. And this is actually a pretty old receiver at this point, but Spektrum has not updated their protocol in many years, so there is no reason to change it to something else if I'm going to stay on Spektrum. Lastly is the battery, which is a Tattu Fun Fly 4S 1300, which is just the lightest 4S 1300 on the market. I'm sure some of you are wondering why I don't fly 6S. Well, for a quad this light and this efficient, I really do not need more power of 6S. And because the amp draw is so low, there are really minimal efficiency gains to be had by going to 6S. And one thing I did forget to mention is the 3D printed GoPro mount. So it's my custom design. It's very minimal. It weighs under 15 grams. And it does have this ring around the ND filter to help prevent the ND filter from getting shattered. But other than that, there's not too much camera protection because I want this thing to be as light and as responsive as possible. All right, so those are all of the components that I'm running. Now let's talk about how much this thing weighs. So the dry weight without the GoPro and the battery is 317 grams, which is super light. And with the GoPro Hero 8 and the Tattu Fun Fly 1300 4S, it is 598 grams all up, which is super light. I'm super happy that this version is under 600 grams yet again. And let me tell you, a sub 600 gram 6-inch freestyle quad flies so nicely. I'm super excited to get this thing in the air and feel what the version 7 feels like. So that's gonna be the next video. We're gonna get this thing all tuned up in beta flight and fly it for the first time, dial in the PIDs. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that video. Please like this video if you liked it, and I'd love to hear in the comments if you like these kinds of build/project videos. I'm thinking about making more of them in the future, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.